Good evening. Thank you for gathering. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation. Maybe we'll just let you back at that pretty soon. So thank you for coming these weeks. My plan is to conclude this evening. Of course, we're just barely skimming the top of the superficial surface at St. Thomas. But hopefully it gives you just a little bit of a flavor of Aquinas, and maybe in your better moments you can dig out the Zoom and say, boy, this brings back such happy memories. Those Sunday evenings. So just to say, I am on call for the hospital. If I suddenly bolt out, that's why, but I'll let you know if that happens. So tonight we want to start with this word. I don't know if you can read it from where you are. Have you heard that word, Philip?
When you wrote it down?
Yes. Anybody familiar with that word? If you're in healthcare, maybe.
What is it?
It's hard to read. Bamlanivimab. So this is one of the new antibody treatments that is being proposed under an emergency use authorization for coronavirus, for COVID-19. So bamlanivimab, I've been practicing that because we have a meeting tomorrow about allocating bamlanivimab. And we all had to learn remdesivir a couple months ago. I wonder, that's what I was going to ask somebody in healthcare, where did they get the name? Is it from the chemical name?
Sometimes it's chemical, sometimes it's a scientist that scientist.
Yeah. Maybe there was a John Bam.
My philosophy is they just sit on the keyboard, whatever comes out.
There was a Far Side cartoon where the guy was sitting in the office and the doctor got a Ouija board and he's spelling out this drug name and he says, well, I don't know what it is, but let's try it. And the caption was, John was beginning to doubt his HMO. So tonight we'll talk a little bit about St. Thomas's moral theory, virtue, natural law, and his moral theology and moral philosophy. And then we'll have a little time, hopefully, for some questions. But we'll begin in prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Together, O God, who made St. Thomas Aquinas outstanding in his zeal for holiness and his study of sacred doctrine, grant us, we pray, that we may understand what he taught and imitate what he accomplished. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Okay, last time we talked about happiness, and that's why I had the baby up there. Everybody tries to make babies smile, you know. It's a fascinating thing, what goes on in those little infant crania and how they react to certain stimuli like that. They don't always smile. Maybe you've noticed that. Sometimes they're unhappy when they're babies, but they can be distracted by St. Thomas. So last time we talked a little bit about the human soul, the human person, and what is our end or goal, beatitude, perfect happiness, which is the vision of God. However we understand that, with God being a pure spirit, there's nothing visually to see, but to be in communion with, in perfect union with the love of God. So Aquinas calls it the contemplation of God, in seeing, whatever that means, intellectually the divine essence, not just things about God, but knowing God as much as humanly possible, with the intellect perfected by grace. And that brings, then you can get into this whole thing about when did Jesus know that he was God? We had a whole class on this in Italian, taught by a Spaniard speaking Italian. It was a little fuzzy at times. But Aquinas' basic argument in the end was that Jesus knew as much as the human intellect could know. And while his divine intellect knew all things, again, that causative knowledge of the divine intellect, it spilled over, is the term Aquinas uses, I don't remember what it is in Latin, spilled over into his human intellect. And so as his human intellect developed from an infant and a child and a teen, so his understanding, humanly speaking, developed of his identity as the Son of God. Fascinating. Anyway, we achieved this end of beatitude or perfect happiness with God by our freely willed human actions. Remember that with every cognitive power, our ability to understand, goes an appetitive power, a desire or a motivating force that moves us toward that thing that we know. And because humans have this abstract, universal potential in their intellect, we are also free. Unlike material objects or plants or lower animals that simply unfold their nature by necessity, humans are free. And so this is why there is no, as I mentioned, there's no doggy morality classes, or cat ethics. They just do what those animals do. Humans have freedom and a variety of paths to reach that end. So we perform human actions that are in accord with the divine will, which is perfect good. Or we fail to do that, and that's what we call sin. When we freely and knowingly choose to go in a different direction than the divine will. So what does Aquinas say about how we get there? He starts out talking about voluntariness. And that should seem fairly obvious, but when he analyzes all these things, he realizes maybe I didn't understand it quite as well as I thought I did. The voluntary is what proceeds deliberately from free will. And there's always various forces that act upon us. Can be habit, can be peer pressure, can be need or necessity, can be example of others, good or bad. But the voluntary is what proceeds from free will. And our responsibility then is correlative with, it is related inherently to our degree of freedom. There are several things, as he says, that can lessen our freedom in concrete actions and therefore reduce our culpability. This might sound a little familiar from examination of conscience and going to confession and things like that. Force, if somebody makes us do something against our will, that removes our culpability for those actions, or at least reduces it. Fear, which is a pretty common motivation, so much so that the Council of Trent had to distinguish between contrition, which is perfect sorrow for sin, and attrition, which is sorrow for sin because I will be punished. It's not so much that I failed God, but I'm afraid for my hide, so. Ignorance, I didn't realize this was so bad. I didn't realize this was wrong. I didn't realize the impact it would have on other people. Or habit. Now we're responsible, of course, and we'll talk quite a bit about habit later, but we're responsible for forming habits that lead to sin. But in the concrete action, if we are in the bond of certain habits, it can reduce the culpability of that individual action. Maybe people sometimes out in the garage working on cars might develop a somewhat colorful vocabulary, for instance. And I'm responsible, that person would be responsible for developing that habit. But just when you smash your finger and you say a naughty word, the moral gravity of that is reduced in that instance by a bad And this is more Calvin and Hobbes. I need some help with my homework, Hobbes. What's the assignment? I'm supposed to write a paper that presents both sides of an issue and then defends one of the arguments. What's your issue? That's the problem. I can't think of anything to argue. That's hard to believe. I'm always right and everybody else is always wrong. What's to argue? You might know some people like that. So very often when people will come to confession, this is one of the struggles where they will, to adequately, accurately understand an individual's culpability, sometimes we ask some questions. And it's not to probe or pry, but to understand. So when people come in, kids like to say this, so they just sit there and stare at you. What would you like to confess? My sins. Well, what are they? I did something bad. Can you be more specific? So you got to unpack a little bit. The Code of Canon Law says that confessors are to refrain from asking questions unless they're necessary. So this isn't like a big gossip session where we're just morbidly curious about things. It's only to understand exactly what the confession is about. And so one of the common things, we'll hear more of this when people come back after coronavirus. I missed Mass 3 weeks in a row. Well, there's no obligation right now. And it's understandable. Or, you know, I was sick with COVID and I missed Mass. If you're sick, the obligation ceases. So it's not to yell at people or to make them feel bad or make them feel inadequate, but it's to understand their situation and the actual gravity of where their freedom lies with these things. So our freedom is the key to understanding our culpability. You've often heard, no doubt, about the tres fontes, the three fonts of morality. And courts of law basically use this same idea: means, motive, and circumstance. Aquinas calls them the means, or the actual action that we're doing. What physically or mentally is performed. What's actually done. The intention is the agent's purpose, goal, end, aim, the reason that motivates the action. We'll come back to intention because intention can be complex. We can have an ultimate intention and then a bunch of more immediate subsidiary intentions for our actions. And circumstances, the 7 circumstances: who, what, where, by what age, why, how, and when. And circumstances can change the morality of an action. When certain things happen, who are the victims of my wrongdoing, how did I do it, where did it take place, and so on. The means and the intention together make up what is called the moral object. Why does this matter? You might remember, so in 1993, St. John Paul II wrote an encyclical called Veritatis Splendor, or the Splendor of Truth. And it was about moral theology. And he was essentially correcting a trend in morals that had taken place from about the 70s on, especially in the 80s maybe, called proportionalism. And proportionalism was a moral theory that as long as there was a due proportion between the good to be done and the evil that took place, then the action could be justified. Okay, that sounds simple enough, and Aquinas would agree up to that point, until you get to the point where they would say, so even things like abortion or killing or those were kind of the two, contraception, sterilization, those were kind of what prompted this moral theory to try and justify those things, that those could be acceptable if the proportion between good and evil was appropriate. And of course, John Paul and other theologians said, no, that is absolutely not so. What they did, what the proportionalists did basically was divide the moral object. The means don't matter as long as my intention is good. And for Aquinas, the means and the intention together make up the moral object. So there's certain things that simply cannot be done, morally speaking, no matter what your subjective intention might be. They're called intrinsic evils in the Catechism. And so abortion, sterilization, contraception, rape, murder, euthanasia, those are things that no circumstance can ever morally justify. Now, the individual culpability of people involved might vary, again, depending on these forces that are acting upon the individual subjectively. But objectively, those are actions that can never lead to human happiness or beatitude with God. So, now, there are people that will disagree with this. Of course, I'm just giving you the Thomistic understanding of this. So, even a subjectively good intention cannot justify a wrongful means. And a bad intention can taint an otherwise good means. So Aquinas uses the example of someone who will give alms to a poor person in order to gain applause or to get a reputation. That's their main motivation. They do a good thing, but with a bad intention, or a contrary intention, at least, to the action itself. And you can also, so Aquinas will talk about the universal destination of goods, and the Catechism talks about this as well. A person who is genuinely in need for, like, to survive, food, to steal, if you've ever read Les Miserables, this is where that sort of becomes central. To steal a loaf of bread in order to stay alive and provide for my family is not morally wrong because of the universal destination of goods. No one should have to be put in that situation where their survival depends on doing something that society would say under normal circumstances would not be acceptable. Moral theology, when I was in the seminary, the first 3 years were the bachelor's of theology, and then you specialize. And I remember telling Bishop Speltz that I'll do anything but moral theology. So then I ended up in this ethics program. So anyway, the degree I got was in dogmatic theology, which was so nice because everything's cut and dried and clear, and it's there, and you're either right or you're wrong. Moral theology is really fuzzy. And because it involves these kinds of prudential judgments about a person's freedom, about the circumstances of the action, about what their intention really was. And sometimes we can't even clearly articulate our own intention because it's sometimes very complex and interwoven with a variety of things. Just like we can have more than one emotion at the same time, we can have more than one intention at the same time. Oh, there it is. We can have more than one intention. Sometimes they're nested together. I get up because I have to go to work, because I have to feed my family, because I love my spouse and my children. So there's this kind of series of intentions, the more immediate. We don't always think in the grand end scheme of things because I want to show my love for God and I want to live with God forever. That's not what makes me roll over and hit the snooze necessarily. But we get into these kind of habits of action. And this is the point of spiritual direction or going on retreat or just some time out in the deer stand, maybe with reflection. Where is my life going? What really is important to me? What are my ultimate values? And what motivates me? When you look at that, sometimes we find that we're motivated by habit, sometimes by expectations or peer pressure of the people around us, sometimes by fear, sometimes by envy or a sense of inadequacy or competition. There's all kinds of things that can move us. Ideally, the spiritual life as it develops becomes more and more, I want to be in union with God. I want to do God's will. I want to live in charity. Those kinds of higher motivations. Doesn't mean that those others will just disappear, but the more conscious we can become about our purpose in life and our activity, the more meaningful it becomes for us, and the better we can evangelize others as well. So Aquinas says that if you look at a decision that you make when you do a human act, you go through several steps. We take counsel. In other words, what should I do? The sink is stopped up. What should I do? We choose a means. I am going to get the plunger. We consent to the means. I want to use the plunger. We employ the means. We plunge. And hopefully we have success. We sometimes end up calling the plumber or somebody else. We rarely parse these steps in ordinary choices. We just kind of act pretty much spontaneously and often out of habit. But if you stop and think, and when we have difficult decisions to make, we kind of slow down that process, and you want to avoid what's often called analysis paralysis, where you just kind of keep taking counsel and think, well, we should know all the things we could do, and all the possibilities. And that's important for complex decisions, but at a certain point, Aquinas says, morality is a practical activity. And so it has to end up doing something. And sometimes saying, I'm not going to do anything, or I'm not going to address that, or not right now, is itself a choice or a decision. But sometimes we can just work ourselves around in circles and circles and circles. Is there such a thing as good and evil in human actions? So let me pause for a minute. I don't know if this is coming up later, but human actions are anything that a human does. Human acts, he distinguishes as those things that proceed from freedom and will. So coming to class on Sunday evening is a human act. Sneezing, tripping over the rug, coughing, all those things, those are done by humans, but they're not human acts. We don't deliberately think, let's see, it's almost 7:30, I better cough pretty soon. It just kind of happens to us. And sneezes generally come in threes. You know how that is when you get two and you're waiting for that last one. It just might be days later. At last. So good and evil arise in human acts, not just human actions. And Aquinas would say that there are certain things, very few, but some which are indifferent. So he uses the example of stroking your beard or picking up a twig off the ground. They have no purpose in them. There's no, maybe we might say playing cards, listening to music or something. There's no real motivation or purpose. It's just an action that we do. It's indifferent, morally speaking. Now, if I choose to pick up a stick so I can beat my neighbor, that would be a human act. So where do goodness and evil arise? They're ascribed to human acts. Either they do or don't conform to God's will and lead to our proper end. Remember we said goodness is some participation in the goodness of God, who is the source of all that is good. Evil, for Aquinas, is always a privation, something that's missing from an action to achieve its proper end. And obviously that evil, we're not talking about demonic kinds of things. This is a descriptive term. The evil or the harm can be greater or lesser, depending on how it impacts our achieving our final end. This is Calvin again. I feel bad that I called Susie, who is his friend, Susie Durkins, I called Susie names and hurt her feelings. I'm sorry I did it. Maybe you should apologize to her. I keep hoping there's a less obvious solution. Okay, so Aquinas is often called, somewhat incorrectly, a natural law theologian. Most of Aquinas is virtue. His ethics is mostly virtue, but because of what virtues are, they're habits that lead toward the human good. We have to know what the human good is, and we find that in natural law. We'll come back to this in some detail in just a moment. So I brought along the books. This is volume 2, the Secunda Secundae, questions 1 to 189. So all of that is about the virtues. Natural law is half a question. So by sheer volume, Aquinas is primarily a virtue ethicist, but built on natural law. Okay, what does that mean? He begins this discussion by discussing and describing, following Aristotle, habit. Well, kind of a rough and ready understanding what a habit is. We've all got them. We develop them over time. Repeated actions of the same type develop habits. Some habits are good habits. We call them virtue. Some habits are bad habits, like garage vocabulary for some of us. That's a vice. They're just two sides of that coin, virtue and vice. And they're stable inclinations. Very important. Following Aristotle again, Aquinas will point out that virtue is not a thing. You can't go online and get it. You can't shop for it. You can't store it up. You can't borrow it from somebody else or buy it from somebody else. It's this habit that we develop over time. Virtue does not guarantee that we will do the right thing. It makes it more likely, like all of our habits. We can go against our habits sometimes, but the inertia, the kind of weight, the gravity of habit means we'll probably go in the same direction. And every year, New Year's resolutions or Lenten resolutions, people try and change habits, and if you really try that, you know how hard that is. And they say, I can just do that anytime. Well, not really, it's not so easy. Some habits are pretty minor and they're relatively easy to change. Sometimes we might do it out of the fact that my wife is going to leave home if I keep this up. Or maybe it's a health thing, you know, I feel better if I stop doing that, eating that, spending, drinking that diet soda, whatever it might be. Sometimes, so we need some motivation to change habits. Just in the same way, having a vice, a bad habit, doesn't mean that we're stuck there, that we're always good, that there's no way for us ever to change. It just makes it that much harder. The longer and deeper a habit gets ingrained in us. Habits can become so deeply ingrained that Aquinas calls them second nature. Our first nature is how we're made. These kind of natural inclinations that we have in our bodies and our minds. Habits can become so strong, they're like our natural being. They're like a second nature. And that makes it hard to change. When we think of virtue and vice, often we think of them in moral terms, good and bad. But virtue and vice really are they're associated with any quality or capability that we have. So there's artistic virtue. Some people can draw a round circle. When I try and draw on the board, it always goes downhill. I don't know why, no matter how I try. Some people are just very artistically talented. They have that virtue, and others of us struggle to do that. Some people have intellectual virtue. They're clear thinkers. They're orderly in their minds. They have a broad vocabulary. They can kind of see through arguments and find what is true and where it maybe falls short. It's a habit that is developed along with a natural gift. They have an intellectual virtue. Some people have rhetorical virtue. They're good at persuading other people. Maybe they're in sales, maybe they're in politics, maybe they're in some other field where convincing people of a certain point of view is a valued skill. Augustine taught rhetoric. So when you read Aquinas' Latin, it's very simple, very limited vocabulary, very elementary sentence structure. When you read Augustine, it's very flowery. It's all kinds of these subjunctives and super particle pluperfect kinds of things. He's just a very eloquent writer. That was a skill that he had. There's athletic virtue. Some people are very good at football, baseball, hockey, whatever. Others struggle. When we talk about virtue and vice, though, mostly we mean in moral terms. From the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, Aquinas borrows this phrase you've often heard, in medias stat virtus, virtue lies in the mean. And what he means by that is that, so he uses the example of a wrestler. This is Aristotle. For a wrestler to eat like a child means that he will starve. For a child to eat like a wrestler means he'll just probably burst. So the virtue lies in somewhere in between. Excess, too much. Defect, too little. And while we might think of them along a line, excess is way over here, defect is way over here, Aquinas says they're actually more like a circle. Excess and defect are often actually very close to one another. So, for instance, the virtue of courage or fortitude. An excess of courage is rashness. I'll just jump. I don't care what happens. I'll just look later. To rush into things without sufficient forethought, taking precautions, no matter what the risk, that's rashness. That's a vice or a lack of virtue, something missing. The defect of courage is cowardice. In the book of Proverbs, it says, I better not go out in the street, there might be a lion out there. So there's always a reason why you can't do anything. They're fairly close together. Both of them cause us to fail in our responsibilities and to fail in virtue. So the virtue lies somewhere in the mean, and as Aristotle says, that's going to vary from person to person, sometimes circumstance or situation to another. So finding the virtuous path is not a simple algorithm. It takes a lot of factors into account. And as we develop virtue, maybe that mean moves a little bit. I become more reliably just or fair or honest. And so a fall or a failure in that might be more serious for me than it would be for someone who has not yet developed that habit of honesty. So because moral virtue has to do with the highest good of the person, not athletics or art or intellect, it's the most important of the virtues. You know this, I'm sure, from the Catechism. There are 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. St. Paul does a great deal on this in the end. There are 3 things that last: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, because God is love. So those 3 virtues are given to us when we are baptized. They are infused virtues. We cannot earn them, we cannot merit them, we cannot acquire them. They are gifts from God. We can improve them, we can grow in those virtues, but ultimately, that's why they're called theological, because they come from God. The moral virtues, which you find in the book of Wisdom, listed as such, right out of Aristotle. Wisdom, the later chapters, particularly were written in Greek, fairly close to the time of Jesus, maybe 150, 200 years before the time of Christ. And so you begin to see, they were written in Greek originally, and you begin to see some of this Greek philosophy in the scriptures, very different than the Hebrew thought of the Pentateuch and so on. Some of the language, some abstract thinking. You know, when you read the Psalms, the Hebrew thought was very concrete. It uses stuff, physical images. God is a rock. Greek thought was more abstract. God is infinite. God is eternal. Those are concepts, not the, you understand, they mean the same kind of thing. God is reliable and sturdy and unmoving. But God is a rock is a very visual, visceral kind of thing to understand. Is he granite? Is he feldspar? That's not exactly what it means. But the moral virtues are sometimes called cardinal virtues. The word cardinal comes from the Latin word cardis, which means hinge. So they're kind of the hinge virtues. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. We'll come back to those. But you find them in the book of Wisdom. They are what that whole half of that book is about. Those four virtues and their parts, the consequences of them. So, for instance, religion, the virtue of religion is a part of justice. It's what we owe to God. It's what is due to God. So religion, he would say, is a part of justice. We'll come back to those four virtues. And all the virtues are linked, the nexus or the connection of virtues. So if you can't be merely just if you're not prudent or don't have courage or don't have temperance. You can't simply be a prudent person without ever putting it into action with these others. So they're connected. And when we grow in one of the virtues, we become stronger in all of them, or at least more capable of developing them. When we fail in any one of them, it makes the others harder for us. Again, virtues make it easier for us to keep the law, quote unquote. And then Aquinas goes into what we mean by law. Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by the one with the care of the community and promulgated. These are the four conditions for the definition of law. So it's something that is rational. Now, you can have other kinds of laws that are irrational laws, but those are not, Aquinas would say, those are not good laws that bind us. Law is an ordinance of reason. We can understand why, or the purpose, even if we disagree with it, but we can see what the goal of this ordinance is, speeding, to keep the community safe. And it's for the common good. Law is never just an individual thing. Law is for a community. Each individual is bound by those laws if they belong to that community, but law is always for others, for the good of the whole, the common good. It's made, who makes laws? The one who has the care of the community. This, of course, also out of Aristotle, and really Plato, too, from the Republic. That the goal of law is not to benefit the individual or the lawmaker or the person or people in power. It is for the care of the community. Authority always is correlative to responsibility. The greatest among you is the one who serves the rest, Jesus says. So authority exists for service, never for its own sake. And the law has to be promulgated. In other words, You can't have secret laws that, well, you were supposed to know that. I never told you, but you were supposed to just guess. So good law is clearly communicated to people, what the expectations are. I learned that fairly early on, although I don't always consistently do it in ministry, that I should never be upset with people for not doing things that I never told them I expected. You have to be clear. We do marriage preparation. That's one of the things we talk about in Fully Engaged, or the old focus. It's about expectations. What do I think my spouse is going to be like? And if I never enunciate them, but merely build up resentment that you don't guess what I mean, that's not good communication. So Aquinas has this kind of, much like we saw the chain of being earlier, there's also different grades of law. The will of God, the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God, the being of God is the divine or eternal law. And again, because God's knowledge causes, it isn't caused by things around it. This divine law is what gives reality its reality. Natural law, then, we'll come back to that in just a moment, is the rational creature's participation in that eternal law. We are positioned so that we can grasp God's purpose to a certain degree. We can understand the reasonableness of what God is trying to do. Makes sense to us. We don't always like it, we don't always agree with it, often fail to comply with it, but it's an ordinance of reason. And then there's also positive or human law, and that can be in civil society or in the life of the church, civil law or canon law. And you can see that as you descend, if you will, down here, you've got more and more room for error or departure from that divine purpose, particularly positive or human law. Natural law is so often misunderstood. And again, going back to moral theology, particularly after Humanae Vitae and the question about contraception and sterilization, there was often the attempt to define natural law or equate natural law, it goes back even before that, with the laws of nature, like gravity or the orbit of the planets or the way plants grow. And the idea that, well, just because when people have sex they can have babies doesn't mean that there's anything magic or moral about that. It's just a law of nature. And we shouldn't be so bound to these natural laws because we can rise above them with our technology and our human freedom. So we really need to understand what Aquinas means, what the church means when it uses the term natural law. So because we are free, natural law is not merely the laws of nature of our bodies. It's not mere biological necessity, and it's not a constraint of some sort on human freedom. Natural law is about achieving human fulfillment, not something that is opposed to it. More Calvin and Hobbes. Hobbes, do you think morality is defined by our actions or by what's in our hearts? Hobbes says, I think our actions show what is in our hearts. Calvin says, I resent that. It's in my heart. So I'm going to read you some of Aquinas, because what he says about natural law is really very, as I say, very brief but rich. The precepts of the natural law are to the practical reason, in other words, doing things, making decisions, action. So natural law to practical reason, but the first principles of demonstrations are to speculative reason. They're self-evident principles. So what is first in speculative reason? A thing may not both be and not be at the same time in the same manner. The law of non-contradiction. That's self-evident. And so too, for practical reason, the self-evident precept is good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Okay, but what's what? Which is which? Well, we're getting there. The first principle in the practical reason is the good is that which all things seek after. Remember, every agent acts for an end. So the first precept of law is the good is to be done, evil is to avoid. All other precepts of the natural law are based on this, that we're trying to do good and avoid evil. So that whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as human good or evil belongs to the precepts of the natural law, as something to be done or avoided. So you see, natural law is not this list of do's and don'ts, it's a lens by which I try and understand what is good or evil for the human person. According to the order of natural inclinations is the order of the precepts of natural law. And we got to go back to the chain of being. What's the thing we have as human beings, what's the thing we have in common with everything else that we are, that we exist? And that, along with animals, we are alive. So the first precept is that most basic thing to preserve our life, to survive, to continue in being. Anything that has to do with that is part of the natural law. Food, agriculture, cooperation, sleep, exercise, a good diet, all those things. Those are related to natural law. Second, going up that chain, we are alive. We are similar to the animals in the sense that we have sensation and we can move toward or away from, toward things that help us, away from things that harm us. So those things belong to natural law, which nature has taught all animals, such as sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. That's all he says about it. Doesn't say contraception is wrong. He doesn't say that parents are the primary educators of children. All natural law does is circumscribe the things that are subjects of morality. And then third, because we are rational beings, a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live. And here you can imagine Aquinas living with the Dominicans in the monastery. Sure that he hurt some of them and some of them hurt him. To avoid offending those among whom one has to live, and other such things regarding this information. So natural law is really just a very broad understanding of what are the parts of the person and where are we free. Then we get into more specific things. But natural law doesn't give us this laundry list of do's and don'ts. It's merely circumscribing the territory. And because we are rational and free, we have some choices. Natural law is the same for all. Remember after the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's sort of that understanding that natural law, anyone who shares human nature, is bound by natural law and protected by natural law. So from the theological, philosophical point of view, your race, ethnicity, height, weight, sex, education, all these other accidents about the human person are secondary to sharing human nature and being bound by and freed by natural law. So it's the same for everybody, but not everybody understands it the same, or to an equal degree or to an adequate degree. And it's also colored by culture, place, time, habit, the society we live in, the media we consume, our political preferences. All of these things can color how we understand what is right and wrong, what the human person ought to do in order to be happy. But Aquinas says it cannot ever be, while it can be impacted by all those things, and maybe overlooked or forgotten. It can never be, quote unquote, blotted out in the heart of man. Natural law will never be lost. And when we can sort of bracket ourselves from all of those outside influences, and even our personal experiences in history and this day, what does it mean to be human, made in the image of God? We begin to rediscover what the natural law asks of us and offers. So as I mentioned, the rest of all that is about the virtues and all the vices, the allied virtues and parts. 827 pages of fine print in 2 columns and page after page, where he goes through all of these different kinds of virtue. I should read some of them too, because they're fascinating. I'm not going to read the whole question, but they'll give you just some sort of feel for that. Can I stand by one line? So in faith, for instance, you have heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, hope, despair, presumption, charity considered of itself, joy, peace, mercy, beneficence, alms deeds, fraternal correction. You tell your husband you should really be doing that. Hatred, sloth, envy, discord, contention, schism, war, strife, sedition, scandal, and then prudence, imprudence, negligence, right, justice, injustice, judgment, restitution, respect of persons, murder, injuries, theft and robbery, the injustice of the judge in judging, reviling, backbiting, tale-bearing, derision, cursing, cheating, sin of usury, religion, devotion, prayer, adoration, sacrifice, oblations, and first fruits, tithes, vows, oaths, taking the divine name for the purpose of invoking it by means of praise, superstition, idolatry, perjury, sacrilege, simony, piety, boasting, irony, affability, flattery, quarreling, liberality, prodigality, apokia or equity, piety and precepts of justice, martyrdom, fear, fearlessness, daring, magnanimity, presumption, ambition, vainglory, pusillanimity. Great word. So pusillanimous. Small soul is what it means. Magnificence, meanness, patience, perseverance, shamefacedness, abstinence, fasting, gluttony, sobriety, drunkenness, chastity, virginity, lust, the parts of lust, continence, incontinence, clemency, and meekness, anger, fruit, modesty, and it goes on and on and on. So he had a very comprehensive understanding. So you might think again, Aquinas is just this very cold, rational person. He understands human nature and all the ways that we can go right and perhaps go wrong as well. Just a few words on the moral virtues. Prudence. There's a great book by Joseph Pieper, The 4 Moral Virtues. It's out of print, but you can easily find it. Joseph Pieper, P-I-E-P-E-R. And it goes into great detail following Aquinas, primarily on these moral virtues. So he points out, we often think of prudence as being kind of just really very careful. It's not what prudence means. Prudence is right reason about things to be done. Sometimes it's very bold action. Sometimes it is. Maybe we better think this through more carefully. Sometimes prudence means waiting. Sometimes prudence means there's danger and delay. So he does a nice thing. Remember we talked about artistic virtue? So art is right reason about things to be made. Prudence is right reason about things to be done. So there's something eloquent, beautiful, artistic about a good moral decision. It has a certain elegance, it has a certain proportion, it has something that attracts the eye of the soul. Right reason about things to be done. Prudence will take counsel. Prudence will take into account circumstances. Prudence will look at past history. What has this happened before? What happened? What's been tried? What worked? What doesn't work? Prudence is about best practices. Where are they doing this right? Where are they doing it well? What can we learn from others? Positive and negative experiences. Prudence is trying to find the right answer. It is the bridge between wisdom, where I have this kind of ideal knowledge, and the practical world. In all of its variety and all of its complexity, what should we do? Aquinas, Aristotle says there are no prudent young people, because prudence comes by experience. The school of hard knocks. You learn the most when things, the old saying, experience is what you get when what you thought was going to happen didn't happen. So even our mistakes, our errors can help us grow in prudence. Hopefully, let somebody else make this. You won't do that. Justice. Justice is a complex virtue. Strictly speaking, it is rendering another what is due. And there's the three major kinds of justice. So what the community owes the individual is distributive justice. Rose, bamlanivimab, remdesivir, the appropriate allocation of vaccines, for instance, education, availability of education, access to good health care, access to a stable food supply, a healthy water supply, all those things that no individual can do for him or herself, but the community together does for each. That's distributive justice. Commutative justice is what peers or equals in the community owe each other. This is often like contracts. I sold you my car, you owe me this amount that we agreed upon. And this is where a lot of contract, tort law, all of that comes from, where people fail to live up to their responsibilities to their peers in the community. And then there's retributive justice. If a person fails in their responsibilities to a peer or to the community, there can be certain punishment, which is intended to be medicinal, to bring about restitution and right order again in the community. There's different ways to think of justice. Should everybody get the same? People aren't all the same. There's images making its way around. You might have seen this. It's a kind of a nice way to depict this. So there's a child, a teenager, and an adult. And they're standing behind a fence trying to watch this ball game. And of course, the adult can see over the fence. The teen, if he stands on tiptoes, can. The child only sees this fence. So equality says they're all standing on the ground, they're all equal. But the outcome is equal. Equity would say, we'll give a taller box so that where their eye level is, all is the same. They're treated differently, but they each have what is necessary for them. And that's a nice picture of society in the complexity of it. Some people need more, some people need less. And that will vary across individual circumstances, age, education, where they live, there's all kinds of things. So John Rawls was a philosopher now deceased, but he wrote a book called Justice as Fairness. And it's a kind of an intriguing way to think of this. His thought experiment is, how would I order society if I didn't know where I would fit in a social order? If I was going to be one at the top, one at the bottom, one in the middle, how would I order this if I had no self-interest in this? But I could be any one of those social strata. You can think of justice in terms of an equal measure, an equal proportion, an equal responsibility. There's 6 different theories of justice that you could defend. So justice is complex, just to be aware of that. But ultimately, it's rendering another what is due to that individual or that. And in God, rendering, what do we render to God? Praise, worship, our allegiance, our obedience, whatever you want to say. All that is part of religion. Fortitude has 2 major parts. Fortitude is the courage to resist harm, and it is the patience to endure harm that cannot be resisted. So patience is a part of courage. To be able to say, I can't change that, but rather than whine and complain and lament and poor me, I endure it. I accept it, not because it's good, but because my acceptance, my perseverance is a good. So fortitude has those 2 aspects. And figuring out where the line is sometimes can be difficult. When have I just given up, even though I could speak up or act in a different way? And when am I just too stubborn to accept reality as it is? And then temperance. Due moderation matters of food, drink, and sex. So if you look at these, they follow sort of again, that idea of the parts of the person. The intellect, our ability to be in relationship, our bodily goods, and then this is kind of the most bodily stuff, the basic things that we need in order to survive. And again, here's where the connection of virtues is relevant. Because if I have intemperance, if I don't have moderation in those most basic things, I'm not going to be very good at justice or fortitude or prudence either. I can be held back. And this is why this is my personal view, I think, but so one of the struggles that many people have in our society today is pornography. It's just so pervasive, it's everywhere on every device, and because it attacks our moderation at that most basic level, it makes everything harder for us up the line. So the C.S. Lewis will talk about the screw tape letters, how the evil will attack those most basic parts of us, and that just makes it harder and harder to do the higher things as well. So, good order in our lives, that kind of self-discipline that even when nobody's watching will help us develop virtue in all the areas. I should pick up my song. How are you doing any New Year's resolutions? I didn't make any. See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good. That implies certain values. But we all know values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid. We need to tolerate diversity. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different. I don't know if I can tolerate that much tolerance. I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtue as freedom. We can talk ourselves into all kinds of things. From there, after working his way through the virtues and the vices, Aquinas turns, and again, he's a theologian. This is the Summa Theologia. Much of it is philosophy, but he does spend time on the theological concepts as well. He goes from here to, remember Exodus and Leviticus. All these things come from God, and they come back to God. How do we make our way through the moral life? We need God's grace. How does God give us grace? He sends his Son. And so the rest of the Summa, as far as he got before he had the stroke, was Christology, the human and divine natures of Jesus, his ministry, his miracles, his passion, his resurrection, and then how does he share that redeeming life with us in the sacraments? And he does baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, orders, penance. That's where we start. And then the rest, the supplement was put together by his students. Obviously much different, much less concise, clear, consistent presentation of the rest. You'll remember, no doubt, this is just a couple stanzas of Dorothée de Beauté. In 1264, not 1964, 1264, Wilberforce IV had this idea of a new feast for the church that focused specifically on the Eucharist. And we celebrate it every year as Corpus Christi. Aquinas was commissioned to write the Mass, the hymns, prayers for the Feast of Corpus Christi. And so we just had like the 750th anniversary of that, not too long ago. And the Lauda Zion, the Dorothée de Beauté, Pange Lingua, which is saying usually in that procession on Holy Thursday with the Eucharist. Dorothée de Beauté is just a fragment of this that gives you an idea of Aquinas' artistic mind and the depth of his theological thought. Anybody read Latin? Translated. I adore you devoutly, hiding God. Latens is the participle, an active participle. Not God in hiding, but hiding God. He sort of hides himself. Which under these figures or appearances are truly there. Hidden. To you, I submit my heart totally, because contemplating you, everything else is a deficit. Everything else falls short. Visus tactus gustus, sight, touch, taste, all of them fail in comparison to you. But hearing alone can be fully believed. I believe because the Son of God said, and there is no word of truth that could be true. So it sounds better in Latin, of course, but the richness of that theological understanding, the transparent faith that you could only write some of this if you spent a lot of time thinking and praying and understanding what Jesus does for us and who Jesus is. That ultimately was what Aquinas was about. As I said at the beginning, he was a saint not because he was smart, but because he used the gifts that God gave him the best that he could to make Christ known, to praise God, and to build up the life of the church. 800 years later, we're still reading and contemplating what he wrote and taught. But he would be the first to say, it's not about me. Ignore me. Come to know Jesus. That's what this is about. This is Caravaggio's figure of doubting Thomas, putting his finger in his side. And it's interesting when you read John's Gospel, it doesn't actually say that he did it. It just says, put your finger in your side. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. We don't know that he actually stuck his finger. So maybe he recognized he's serious, this is really him. I didn't dare touch him. Okay, that's it. So, just the other question about a couple things. Redemption, right? Where does that fit? So, for again, a lot of this was philosophy, but for Aquinas, because God does nothing in vain. Humanity created in the divine image, destined for eternal life. So the Catechism will put it this way, that God willed the church from all eternity. Why? because he knew what the church is the communion of all the faithfully united in the love of God. That was God's will from all eternity in creating the human person. We sin, and it's not like God thought, I never thought they'd do that. Now what am I going to do? That in some way, the incarnation, in a way that we can't fully understand, the incarnation, the passion, and the resurrection were intended and willed by God from all eternity. Again, God's knowledge is positive. It doesn't react to things that happen. So this is why we trust God as the judge. This is why we cannot judge ourselves well. Redemption was not sort of like a taking your driver's test again, or saying, you know, I got to go to plan B because I never thought this would happen. It was God's plan from all eternity. So perfect is that divine love that even our sin cannot frustrate God's plan. He knew what he would do. He knew what we would do. He knew what he would do. And so this, one thing I try and communicate, I don't know how successfully, but there's a lot of things that happen in the world, in our history, in our lives, that can cause us anxiety and doubt and despair even. We never need to worry that God is somehow going to fall short. Somehow God isn't going to be able to pull this out, that we're just going to be so bad and so stubborn that he's going to be at a loss. And in the end, he's just going to have to admit failure. God does not fail. We fail. We sometimes fail to understand, we fail to trust, we fail to live up to our commitments. God does not fail. So remember we had that little picture of that single point of light, which was in Dante's writing, the beatific vision. So he called it what? The divine comedy. In Greek art, there's two kinds of dramas. There's tragedies and there's comedies. Tragedies, you read some of Shakespeare, it's so horrible. Everybody dies a horrible death, and there's just absolute chaos at the end. That's what a tragedy is, that nobody wins. Comedy doesn't mean like sitcoms or humor or relentless laughter. A comedy means a happy ending. And so Dante very specifically calls this a divine comedy because God wins. God will always bring us through. Whether we can follow faithfully, that's where our human freedom, our human acts come in. But God will not be defeated. So, does that make sense? A little bit about redemption, where that is. And then you also asked about apologetics. Where did that come from? Justin, in the first centuries, early second century, is already doing apologetics. Whenever there is a dispute or a question about what the faith really means, or is it really true, or how do we understand this, that's where apologetics or an explanation of the faith comes in. In the first really 700 years of the history of the church, all these councils had to do with the divinity of Christ, the humanity of Christ. Secondary to that, where does Mary fit? Does Jesus have one will or two wills? Is it one nature or two natures? We just had the feast of Leo the Great, who was the star of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. One and the same Jesus Christ is both divine and human. One and the same is a divine person with a human nature. It goes on and on. One and the same, one and the same, one and the same. Without division, separation, confusion, or what's the last one? There are four qualities there. This incarnate Jesus, fully God, fully man. And often, practically speaking, we think of Jesus as more God than man, that he really didn't suffer the way we do, we wouldn't really understand what we go through. Or we think he's more human than divine, that Jesus was a nice guy, but really he's just in the same boat as us. Orthodox faith sees both divinity and humanity in Jesus in ways that we cannot fully grasp. By the time you get to the 7th and 8th centuries, you have iconoclasm, where these great works of art and icons are being destroyed because the Old Testament didn't make graven images, and much of the most beautiful artistic religious art is lost to history. You come to, you have the Great Schism in 1054, the Orthodox and Catholic worlds, and that got caught up all in political power and who has sovereignty over the temporal world, who has authority in government as well as the church, and that Pope Benedict put it so well, this has never worked well. The church tries to be a worldly power, it does not have that. And so the church this is where we get the idea of that we enunciate moral principles, but we're not a political power, not a political player. We have something different and higher to offer the world than merely one more blog about politics. The Reformation, when Martin Luther nailed those 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and a number of Calvin's Zwingli Knox, there was more and more fracturing of Christian communion. The Council of Trent was called to articulate really apologetics. What do we really believe? The church always defines dogma in the face of question and opposition, when it's not so clear. We thought everybody knew this. Maybe we need to sort out some of those different interpretations. That's when dogma is defined. Dogma doesn't make something true. It's a recognition of the truth of the faith. And there's things that are true that are not dogmatically declared. But everything that the church has declared as dogma, a Catholic is bound. So, for instance, and this is one of those things with Aquinas we might have talked about, with Scotus. Aquinas could not quite understand how the Immaculate Conception could be a Catholic idea, because it seemed to make Mary exempt from the universal salvation that came only through Jesus Christ. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around that. That darn Scotus came up with this idea of prevenient grace, that somehow that grace that had not yet taken place in history by the death and resurrection of Jesus went ahead of Mary, ahead in time. So Mary was redeemed by Jesus, who didn't even exist yet by the time she was conceived. But again, God's foresight, providence, knowing this would happen, was able to apply that grace because God is eternal, not bound by the things in time. So the Immaculate Conception, well, we would say that was true from the moment it happened. The church didn't define it as a dogma until 1854. An example. The Assumption, 1950. And there's always people that want new dogmas, can we do this or that or this or that. And the church is very cautious of that. So, for instance, with Scripture, there are interpretations of passages of Scripture that the church will say are not accurate. However, the church has never defined a particular text as meaning this and only this. So it means at least this, they will say, but we want to leave God freedom in his own. So dogma, my point basically is dogma is always somewhat intentionally general, patient, and carefully circumscribed. What's the old saying? In necessities, unity. In questionable things, liberty. In all things, charity. Okay. Other questions, comments? You guys have just been so remarkably patient. Thank you very much. Who wants the last word? And the middleman. That's a good place to start. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go in peace. Thank you.